Welcome to Dark Reddit, your late-night escape into eerie calm. I'm Alex, your host for tonight's journey into the shadows. Before we begin, find a quiet, comfortable place to rest. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and gently close your eyes. Tonight's journey lasts 1 hour. 8 chilling tales told softly and slowly, designed to let your mind drift while the darkness unfolds around you. Let your body relax and allow your thoughts to wander. These are the kinds of stories you don't need to see. Only feel. You're safe here. Now, let the night begin. This story begins with an ordinary Christmas tradition, but what unfolded next was anything but ordinary. It was the kind of evening that you associate with family, warmth, and the soft hum of holiday cheer. The basement, dimly lit by a string of colorful lights, smelled of cinnamon, pine, and the faint trace of hot chocolate. My mom, my brother, and I were gathered there, a rare moment of calm before the chaos of presents and food took over the holiday. This was our yearly Christmas tradition, gathering together in the cozy basement to listen to the storybooks that had been passed down in our family. Some were old, weathered with age, and others were newer, more modern. My great-grandmother, a woman with a voice that could warm even the coldest of hearts, had always been the one to send us something special for the holidays. This year, she had outdone herself. It was a Christmas book that, when opened, played a message from her, recorded especially for us. My mom had just pulled the book from its wrapping, her eyes lighting up with the nostalgia of memories from her childhood. "I can't wait for you two to hear this," my mom said, smiling as she flipped the book open. My brother, then 9, was leaning over her shoulder, eager to hear his great-grandmother's voice once again. I, on the other hand, was a little more skeptical. At that age, I was more interested in the toys under the tree than anything else. But there was something about the sound of my great-grandmother's voice that always made me pause. She had a way of speaking that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, her voice gentle and full of life. My mom opened the book, and the familiar crackling static began. For a moment, it sounded like nothing more than a normal message, the kind you'd expect to hear from an old family recording. "Hello, family," my great-grandmother's voice echoed out from the speakers of the book. We all smiled at the sound, the warmth of her voice wrapping us up like a comforting blanket. But then something strange happened. The message continued, but this time it was different. "Hello, Karen," the voice said. There was an unmistakable pause. My mom froze, her hand hovering over the book as though she had just been hit with a sudden chill. "Did it just say my name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at my brother, but he was just as confused as I was. Neither of us could understand what was happening. The recording wasn't supposed to address anyone by name. It was just a general greeting to the family. But now it was as though my great-grandmother was speaking directly to my mom. I watched my mother's face shift from surprise to something deeper, something harder to place. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and she took a step back from the book, her fingers trembling. I had never seen her like this before, so shaken, so lost in thought. My brother, sensing the change in atmosphere, tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, what's wrong?" But she didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, staring at the book as if it might hold the answers to a question she hadn't yet asked. Her mind was clearly elsewhere, caught up in memories that she didn't want to revisit, or perhaps ones she couldn't quite comprehend. Finally, she snapped out of it, gently closing the book. Her hands were still trembling as she held it. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice far quieter than usual. That shouldn't have happened." My brother and I both looked at her, unsure of what we had just witnessed. My mom had explained the book to us before. It was a simple Christmas greeting, a recording that my great-grandmother had made some years ago, a voice preserved for future generations. There was no way that it could have known my mom's name. It was impossible. The batteries were in perfect condition, and the device had been working just fine. And yet, did she mean to say that? I asked hesitantly, still not entirely convinced. My mom shook her head slowly. No, that's not possible. It was never supposed to say anyone's name. She looked at the book again, as though trying to understand what had just happened. Her hand hovered over the book's spine, but she didn't touch it. It was as if she was afraid to open it again. There was a long, uncomfortable silence in the basement as the three of us tried to make sense of the situation. My mom's mind was clearly racing. I could tell she was trying to find a logical explanation, but there was none to be found. The room felt colder now, despite the warmth of the holiday decorations. The Christmas lights blinked silently, casting odd, shifting shadows across the room. "What do you think it means?" my brother asked, his voice small and uncertain. He was too young to fully understand the weight of the situation, but even he could sense that something wasn't right. "I don't know, sweetheart," my mom replied, her voice strained, "but it's something we need to think about." We didn't open the book again that night. The message from my great-grandmother, now addressed personally to my mom, hung heavily in the air like a lingering presence. No one spoke much after that, and we soon decided to call it a night, though none of us truly felt like sleeping. That Christmas was never talked about again. The book was placed on a shelf, forgotten, its message left unexplained. But for my mom, the incident was a source of quiet contemplation. I could see it in her eyes whenever she thought no one was looking. Something unsettled in her, something unspoken. Years passed and life moved on. My brother and I grew older, and the Christmas book, along with the strange incident, faded from our memories. But not for my mom. She kept that moment in her heart, always wondering if it had been a sign, a message from beyond the grave. Now, as an adult, I look back on that night, and I remember my mother's face. The shock, the disbelief, the quiet fear that she couldn't shake. I still don't know what to make of it, but I fully believe that it was something beyond the ordinary. A message from my great-grandmother, somehow reaching out to her in a way that defies explanation. To this day, my mom believes it was a sign from her grandmother, a way for her to say goodbye, even after death had already claimed her. Whatever it was, the message was personal. And even though I don't remember it as vividly as my mom does, I can't deny that something in the air that night shifted, leaving us all with an unsettling sense of mystery. The book was never opened again, and the mystery of that Christmas greeting remains unsolved, tucked away in the corners of our family history. This next story begins with a game of flashlight tag, but sometimes games don't end the way we expect them to. It was a night like any other spring break evening, full of excitement and that lingering freedom that only comes with being young and staying up late. The air had that cool, crisp feeling that reminded me of the changing season, and the stars were bright in the sky, almost as if they were watching us play. My cousins and I had been eagerly waiting for this moment all day. Finally, the time had come to play flashlight tag. Our house was nestled in the middle of nowhere, a small, secluded place surrounded by endless hills and dense forests. There were no neighbors for miles, just the sounds of nature and the occasional rustling of animals in the trees. The kind of place where silence often feels a little too loud, and the night is just a bit darker than it should be. The perfect setting for a game that should have been harmless fun. I was about 11 at the time, and I remember the excitement buzzing in my veins as I grabbed the flashlight and joined my cousins in the yard. It wasn't just any game, though. It was flashlight tag, and we were going to stay up late. After all, it was spring break and anything felt possible. We played for a while, laughing and dodging in and out of the shadows. The barn stood in the distance, an old, weathered structure that always seemed a little too eerie at night. Despite the strange atmosphere, it was a familiar place. But on this particular night, something felt off. Just 5 minutes into the game, my cousin and I decided to split up. He went toward the house, and I took off in the direction of the barn. As I walked toward the dark, looming shape of the barn, I felt something stir in the pit of my stomach, a sensation I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the uncomfortable feeling you get when you know something's not quite right but can't pinpoint why. I was almost to the barn when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I stared, I realized it was something I couldn't explain. Something bright, something prominent, almost like two glowing eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were too big and too intense. They hovered in front of the barn's fence, standing still, almost watching me. There were no animals in the barn. It was empty, or so I thought. Yet there was something there, something watching me. Without thinking, I turned around quickly and ran toward my cousin, panic bubbling up inside me. I was suddenly desperate to be near him, to be away from whatever I had just seen. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sprinted through the yard, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I finally reached my cousin, I was breathless and terrified. I was expecting him to ask what was wrong, but instead, he looked at me with a confused expression. "You're not being funny," he said, his voice strange. "What do you mean?" I asked, still catching my breath. "I heard you whisper my name," he continued, "and then your dog's name, and then, I swear, I heard someone scream your brother's name. But when it screamed, it sounded like you instead of your brother." I froze, my stomach dropping. I hadn't said anything. In fact, when I was scared, I often went completely silent. It was unusual for me to speak at all when fear gripped me. I didn't even whisper. "I didn't say anything," I said, my voice low, unsure if I was imagining things. "I didn't whisper your name or anyone else's. I didn't scream either. It wasn't me." We stood there for a moment, staring at each other in stunned silence. I tried to make sense of what had just happened, but it felt impossible. It didn't add up. There was no explanation. I had heard nothing, and yet my cousin was so sure of what he'd heard. The air around us felt heavier now, like something was pressing in on us. We couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was watching us. Even though the yard around us was empty, we yelled out to the rest of the group, ready to give up the game and run inside. But there was still no sign of the others. It was strange. Where had they gone? We rushed inside, hearts still pounding in our chests, and that's when we found out something even more unsettling. Everyone was already inside. "Where were you guys?" I asked, bewildered. "We've been looking for you. We've been here the whole time," one of my cousins replied, a grin on their face as if the game had ended and they were ready for a snack or something. "We never went outside." I glanced back at my cousin, who was still standing beside me, just as confused as I was. The feeling that something wasn't right lingered in the air. Who had whispered our names? who had screamed my brother's name as though it was me. We couldn't explain it, and we still couldn't figure out where the voices had come from. There had been no one out there except for my cousin and me, and yet it felt like someone or something had been with us all along. We spent the rest of the evening in the safety of the house, unable to shake off the sense that we weren't alone. That night, the wind howled through the trees, and the darkness outside seemed just a little more oppressive. We could still hear the faintest rustling of leaves, like something or someone was walking through the yard. But when we looked out the window, there was nothing to see but the endless black of the night. I still think about that night all the time, especially when I find myself out in the dark. I never figured out what I saw by the barn or who or what was calling our names. Was it just a trick of the mind, a side effect of being out in the dark for too long? Or was something out there, hiding in the shadows, mimicking our voices and watching us play? To this day, I have no answers. But one thing is certain: I'll never look at the night the same way again. Our next story comes from someone who didn't believe in the paranormal until one night at their grandparents' house. I've always considered myself a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. But there's one thing I've never been able to explain, and it happened in my grandparents' house. A place notorious for its hauntings, even included in a haunted houses tour in the Los Angeles area. People swore it was cursed, full of restless souls, but I always shrugged it off, assuming it was just the stuff of local legends. I was about 6 years old when it happened, and at that time I didn't really have much reason to fear. My sister, who was 12, and I shared a room at my grandparents' house. It wasn't a huge room, but there was something comforting about it, like an old, familiar embrace. My mom had decorated our bedside table with an antique telephone. It wasn't plugged in, didn't work at all, and was nothing more than a decorative piece that my mom loved, a nod to a simpler time. That night, everything seemed normal at first. My sister and I were asleep, wrapped in our own little worlds. But then, for some reason, we both woke up at exactly the same time. It wasn't the kind of waking up you get from a loud noise or an uncomfortable position. No, it was different. We both just opened our eyes, almost as if we were meant to wake up together. We turned to face each other in the dark, but there was something in the air that instantly made me feel uneasy. It wasn't just the usual stirrings of waking up in the night. It was dread, pure and palpable, like a weight pressing down on my chest. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence thick and suffocating. And then it happened. The phone rang. The sound pierced the night, sharp and sudden, and I felt my heart race. It wasn't a normal phone ring, though. It was hollow, distant, as if the sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The antique phone sitting on the bedside table, the one that wasn't plugged in, was ringing. I remember the chill that washed over me. My sister's face mirrored the panic I was feeling. Without saying a word, we both immediately dove under our blankets, hoping that if we just hid long enough, it would go away. The phone continued to ring, but it didn't sound like any phone I'd ever heard before. The noise was grating, unsettling, like it didn't belong. We waited in the dark, holding our breath, frozen under the covers until the ringing finally stopped. Silence filled the room once again, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the night. It was heavy, tense, like something had just passed through the room but left an impression we couldn't quite shake. The next morning, I didn't say anything about it to my sister. I convinced myself that I had imagined it, that maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. After all, it was a weird dream, right? That's what I told myself. But then, a few years later, my sister and I were talking about old memories, as siblings often do. Somehow, we got to talking about strange things that had happened in that room, and she mentioned the ringing phone. My heart skipped a beat. "You remember the phone ringing that night?" she asked, almost as if it was an afterthought. I froze. My mind raced. I hadn't mentioned it to her at all, not once in all the years that had passed. But she remembered it, too. We both had the exact same experience. The same phone ringing in the middle of the night. The same feeling of dread that overtook us. The same terrified silence as we hid under the blankets. We hadn't spoken about it before, yet here we were, confirming each other's memories as if the event had been imprinted in our minds, undeniable and shared. We both knew that we hadn't imagined it. Something happened that night, something that neither of us could explain. And even though we never talked about it again after that, I could still hear the faint ring of the phone in my mind whenever I thought back to that night. There are many more stories from my grandparents' house, too many to recount here. The place was full of strange occurrences. Doors that would creak open by themselves, shadows that moved just out of sight, cold drafts that seemed to appear out of nowhere. But that one, the ringing phone, was the one I couldn't shake. The one that stuck with me even though I didn't believe in the paranormal. As an adult, I still don't know what to believe. I don't think of myself as someone who's particularly open to supernatural explanations, but there are moments when I remember the phone ringing, and I wonder if that house really was haunted. Maybe there's more to this world than we can understand, or maybe some things just can't be explained. But whatever it was that night, the feeling of dread, the sound of that unearthly ring, will stay with me forever. And every time I pass an old antique telephone, I can't help but think about it, wondering if I'll ever find the answers to the strange events that unfolded in that house so many years ago. As you breathe deeper and sink into sleep, his next Reddit tale may just make your skin crawl. Next up is a tale from a family home that's seen more than its fair share of strange happenings. My family lived in an old house in western Massachusetts, one built well before 1865. It had that timeless, almost forgotten charm, with creaky floors and walls that seemed to carry the weight of 100 years of stories. My bedroom was connected to my siblings' room by a door that led straight into theirs. An odd feature, but one we'd grown used to. There were plenty of nights when one of us would wake up and wander into the other's room, whether for company or just because it was more comforting than being alone in a dark house. But there was one night, one single moment, that changed everything for me. I was around 12 years old, and it was well past midnight. The house was quiet, too quiet, with only the faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. I woke up, feeling a sudden need to use the bathroom. I sat up in bed, rubbed my eyes, and turned to get out when I noticed something. No, someone. Standing at the foot of my sister's bed. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had just woken up, and it was possible that I had something stuck in my eyes, or maybe my brain was still tangled in the haze between sleep and wakefulness. I convinced myself it was just the shadows, nothing more. So I calmly closed my eyes again and rubbed them, thinking that when I opened them, the figure would be gone. But when I opened my eyes again, there it was, still standing at the foot of my sister's bed, clear as day. The figure was tall, its shape almost human but somehow not quite right. The air in the room felt heavy, thick, like it was filled with something I couldn't name. My heart began to pound in my chest as I stared at the figure, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I thought, maybe I had just imagined it, that maybe I was still half asleep, but the figure didn't go away. I didn't know what to do. I froze for a moment, the terror rising in my throat, but then something inside me urged me to act. I stood up from my bed, my feet barely making a sound on the old wood floor. I hesitated but finally mustered the courage to speak, my voice shaky as I whispered, "Hey!" To my horror, the figure turned around, and for a brief second, I could swear it looked surprised, almost startled. Its features were hard to make out in the dark, but I could feel its gaze, something cold and distant in the air between us. And just as quickly as it had appeared, it moved out of view, its shadow vanishing toward the upstairs hallway. I was frozen in place for a few moments, unsure of what to do. But then, my instincts kicked in, and I bolted for my sister's room, heart racing in my chest. When I reached her room, I glanced around quickly. Nothing. The figure was gone. I rushed into the hallway, hoping to see someone, anyone, to make sense of the experience. But there, standing at the top of the stairs, was our dog. It wasn't barking, but it was staring intently down the hallway, its head tilted in that way dogs do when they're confused or curious. The way it looked, like it was seeing something I couldn't, made my skin crawl. I stood there, in the dim light of the hallway, my mind reeling. I tried to call out to the dog, but I couldn't make sense of anything that had just happened. The figure, was it a person? A ghost? Some kind of trick of the light? And why had the dog reacted so strangely, staring at something that clearly wasn't there? My thoughts were racing as I moved closer to the dog, but the hallway was still and quiet. There was no trace of the figure, no explanation for what I had just witnessed. I stayed there for a long moment, staring down the dark corridor, waiting for something to give me an answer, but nothing came. Eventually, I went back into my room, the door creaking shut behind me. I never saw the figure again. I tried to convince myself that it had been a figment of my imagination, some trick of my mind in the dead of night. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. There was something in that hallway, something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that made my heart race and my skin prickle with unease. And while I never spoke about it to my parents or my siblings, I knew that whatever it was, whatever I had seen, was still a part of that house. Years have passed since that night, but the memory of it has stayed with me. I've often wondered if others who lived in that house experienced similar things, or if it was just me. The house, with its creaky floors and old windows, still stands, an imposing presence in the quiet neighborhood. I've since moved away, but every time I think back to that night, I feel that same chill, that same inexplicable sense of dread. What was it? Who or what was standing at the end of my sister's bed? And why was the dog looking down the hallway at something I couldn't see? I may never know, but one thing's for sure. That night left an imprint on me that I can never quite shake. As you ready for another? Now, Let's hear a tale where you can't decide if he was friend or foe. When I was very young, around 5 years old, something happened that still gets talked about in my family. It wasn't something I could fully understand at the time, but I can't forget it now. We had gone to visit my grandparents for a big family dinner. The place was packed with relatives and family friends, all gathered in the small apartment. I was the only kid there, which left me with not much to do but wander around the house, finding whatever entertained me in the quiet corners of their home. My grandparents' apartment had a walk-in pantry, a place I always found interesting. I'd often sneak in there, out of the way of the grown-ups, hoping for some peace and quiet. It had a small window that overlooked the outside, and I liked leaning out of it, looking at the world beyond. That night, my grandmother kept sending me out of the kitchen, likely so I wouldn't be underfoot while everyone was preparing the dinner. So, I retreated to my favorite spot, the pantry window. From the window, I could see the sandbox in the courtyard, a place where the other kids in the complex usually played. But tonight, I noticed something unusual. There was a little boy playing in the sandbox all alone. He was focused on his toy truck, moving it across the sand, making the kind of happy noises that kids make when they're lost in their own little world. His presence caught my attention in a way I couldn't shake. I kept staring, leaning closer and closer, trying to get a better look. My mom must have noticed that I wasn't playing or interacting with anyone. She asked what I was doing, and when I pointed at the boy, I remember clearly saying, "I want to play with him." I wasn't thinking anything strange about it at the time. He was just a boy, and I was just another kid who wanted someone to play with. My mom turned to look, and I could tell from the way she reacted that something was off. She asked me a few more questions, each one sounding more puzzled than the last. I could hear the concern in her voice when she asked, "What is he wearing?" I answered her questions, not understanding why she was so interested in the details. To me, the boy was simply a child just like me. But when I looked back out the window, he was no longer there. Perplexed, my mom sent me into the living room, but she returned later, sitting down beside me with a soft, worried expression. She told me I could play with the boy tomorrow, as if she were trying to comfort me, though I didn't understand why. I nodded, accepting her words, but in my little mind, it didn't make sense. Why couldn't I play with him now? And why had he disappeared so quickly? Years later, when I was much older, my mom sat me down and shared something with me that made my blood run cold. The boy I had seen in the sandbox wasn't just a stranger. He wasn't even a living child at all. He was the deceased son of one of our family friends, a boy who had tragically died in a car accident a few years before I was born. According to my mom, the boy's mother had been devastated by his death, and even after all these years, his memory lingered in ways no one could explain. I had seen him that night, playing alone in the sandbox, as if he were still a part of the world, even though he was long gone. No one had ever told me about him at the time. I had no way of knowing that he was the child of someone we knew, much less that he had passed away before I was even born. And yet, somehow I had seen him alive, playing, as real to me as any other child on the planet. To this day, I can't fully explain it. Maybe it was some sort of spiritual visitation, or maybe I was just too young to understand the difference between the living and the dead. But whatever it was real. The image of that little boy in the sandbox is burned into my memory, and the strangest part is that it felt so normal at the time. It didn't feel like I was seeing something paranormal or out of place. It just felt like another kid to play with. I don't know if anyone else in my family had similar experiences with that boy, or if I was the only one who saw him. But every time I think back to that night, I feel a strange sense of wonder mixed with a chill that runs through me. How could I have seen someone who wasn't supposed to be there? How did I know that boy, even though I never met him? The question still haunts me to this day. Now, let's hear what happened when curiosity led to fear. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. Just me and a few friends, escaping the noise of the city and immersing ourselves in the peace of the woods. We decided to go camping, away from the world, surrounded only by trees and the sounds of nature. The fire crackled merrily in front of us, the kind of fire that makes you feel warm and safe, like nothing could possibly go wrong. We were all telling stories, the usual campfire tales. Ghosts, monsters, and things that go bump in the night. It was one of those nights where the darkness felt thicker than usual, where every gust of wind through the trees seemed to carry a whisper. We were laughing, comfortable in our little circle of light, but that's when it happened. At first, it was subtle, a whisper, a rustling in the distance. We all paused, turning our heads toward the edge of the forest, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was too far to be anyone in our group, and at first we convinced ourselves it was just the wind. But as we sat in silence, the sound grew louder. It wasn't wind, not this time. It was a whispering, a low, eerie murmur that seemed to come from deeper in the woods. The voices sounded like they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. There were multiple voices, layered on top of each other, all whispering at once. But the worst part, the words weren't clear, and it didn't sound human. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to convince ourselves it was someone else out there, maybe another group of campers playing a prank. But the more we listened, the more unsettling it became. The whispering wasn't just strange. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. The chill in the air seemed to grow colder, and suddenly, the warmth from the fire felt distant. The forest around us, once calm, now seemed alive in a way we couldn't explain. Then one of my friends, Mike, who was sitting closest to the trees, stiffened. His eyes widened, and his voice dropped to a whisper as he pointed toward the trees. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, his voice trembling. We all turned in unison, our flashlights scanning the area where Mike had pointed. There was nothing at first, just the dark outlines of the trees swaying in the wind. But then we saw it. Between the trees, there was something moving. It wasn't an animal, not by any means. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its movements were unnatural. It didn't walk like a person. Its arms were too long, extending unnaturally as it shifted between the trunks of the trees. The creature seemed to glide, more like a shadow than a physical being, and the way it moved made every one of us freeze in terror. We couldn't explain what we were seeing. It didn't look like anything from the stories we told around the fire. No ghost, no animal, nothing we could place. It was like something from a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist in the daylight. The whispers grew louder, the voices more frantic, as if the creature was communicating with the forest itself. The air felt thick, and for a split second, it seemed like the entire world around us had stopped, except for that figure moving between the trees. Without a word, we all stood up at once, grabbing our things and rushing to the cars. No one said a thing, but we didn't need to. We all knew that staying there was not an option. The fear was real, and every instinct in us told us to get away. Fast. We didn't look back until we were safely in our cars. Engines running, the lights cutting through the dark. No one spoke during the ride home, each of us too shaken to even attempt to explain what we'd seen. But we all knew something out there wasn't right, something that didn't belong in the woods. And we all agreed silently that we'd never go back to that spot again. To this day, the memory of that night lingers. I don't know what we saw that night, but I know it wasn't human. The voices, the tall figure, the way it moved through the trees like it wasn't bound by the same laws of nature. There's no way to explain it. And after that, I've never been able to shake the feeling that something else is out there, watching from the dark corners of the woods. I haven't been camping since. This story begins with an ordinary night that turned into something unforgettable. It was one of those quiet nights when everything felt like it was in its natural place. My wife was out of town for work, and I was in bed, trying to get some much-needed rest. It had been a long week, and I was looking forward to a peaceful night alone. Around 1 a.m., I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps as my son came down the stairs to join me in bed. I barely woke up, mumbling a sleepy acknowledgement as he snuggled in beside me. The night continued, calm and unremarkable, or at least it seemed that way at first. Hours later, I woke up again, not from a noise or a disturbance, but from an inexplicable feeling. My bedroom door had opened and closed, softly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to stir me from my sleep. I rubbed my eyes, still half-dazed, and then saw something that didn't make any sense. A girl. She was walking across the end of my bed, her silhouette faintly illuminated by the soft light filtering through the blinds. I squinted at her, still groggy, and for a moment, I thought it was my daughter sleepwalking. She had done that before, wandering the house in the dead of night, her movements slow and uncoordinated, as if her body was still trying to wake up while her mind remained somewhere else. This girl, though, was different. She wasn't my daughter, at least not in the way I expected. I looked at her reflection in the mirror across the room, and that's when I noticed the details that didn't quite match. She had shoulder-length brown hair and was wearing a red sweater. My daughter didn't own anything like that. Still, I assumed it was her. Maybe she had found a new sweater I hadn't seen before. The clock on the nightstand read 3 a.m. As I lay there watching her walk, she seemed to glide effortlessly across the room, crossing the end of the bed and heading toward the bathroom. I called out my daughter's name, but she didn't respond. The girl didn't even turn toward me. She just kept walking, moving with a strange kind of precision, like she was in some kind of trance. I watched her until she reached the bathroom doorway. Then she stopped and stood there, perfectly still. Her arms began to rise slowly, at first just a little, and then more until her arms were stretched straight out to either side, like she was balancing on an invisible beam. A chill ran through me. I called my daughter's name again, louder this time, the panic starting to rise in my voice. This time, my son woke up, startled, and I saw his eyes widen as he too saw the girl standing there, motionless, her arms stretched out unnaturally to the sides. "Dad?" my son whispered, his voice laced with confusion and fear. I shot out of bed in an instant, flicking on the light. The moment the light flooded the room, the figure vanished. There was no trace of her, no sign of anyone having been there, just emptiness. I was shaking, my heart pounding as I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The bathroom was empty. There was no one in the hallway. I walked upstairs, heart still racing, and found my daughter fast asleep in her bed, completely unaware of the strange occurrence downstairs. Confused and unsettled, I went back down to the living room and stood exactly where the girl had been. The floor was warm to the touch, noticeably warmer than the rest of the room. I shivered, even though the rest of the house felt cold. It was as if whatever had been there had left its imprint on the space, something that still lingered in the air. I eventually crawled back into bed, trying to rationalize what had just happened. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I lay there for nearly 45 minutes, wide awake, unable to sleep. The images of the girl, her arms outstretched, the emptiness of her figure, kept replaying in my mind, every detail like a strange puzzle piece I couldn't fit together. The next morning, I sat down with my son and tried to gently ask about the events from the night before, half expecting him to brush it off as a dream. But to my surprise, he looked at me with wide eyes. "I remember it, Dad," he said, his voice quiet. I woke up and saw her standing in the doorway, wearing a red sweater. It was so weird. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. He remembered it too. The two of us sat there in stunned silence, the realization settling in. We had both seen the same thing at the same time. Neither of us had said anything the night before, but now we both knew. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't just my imagination. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that night. The girl in the red sweater, the way she moved, the way she stood still in that doorway with her arms outstretched. It felt wrong. It felt like something wasn't just out of place, but that we weren't meant to see it. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't something I could easily forget. I don't know what we saw that night, but it has haunted me ever since. And now, when I go to bed, I can't help but wonder, will I ever see her again? This story comes from someone who thought they were living a normal life, until the house itself became something they couldn't ignore. I lived in a house for 8 years, 8 long, strange years. A house that was constantly in motion, even when it was quiet. At first, I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. Sure, I had heard the stories, but I never thought they could apply to me. That was until I spent nearly a decade in a house that constantly defied logic. The first few months were uneventful, almost peaceful. But then it started. Small things, little things that were easy to brush off. The occasional creak of the floorboards, the subtle shift of shadows at the edge of your vision. Nothing overt, nothing that screamed, ghost. It was more like the feeling that someone was always just behind you, lurking out of sight. But then came the noises. The kitchen was the epicenter of most of it. It started with the sound of glass and dishes shattering, the clink of porcelain against porcelain, the sharp crack of something heavy hitting the floor. The noise was loud, impossibly loud, like a storm of broken glass. But every time I rushed into the kitchen to check, everything was exactly where it should be. No shattered dishes, no broken glass, no mess. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mind. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe there were pipes that were too loose and made strange noises. But when it happened in front of guests, when people heard it too, it stopped being so easy to ignore. I remember one time we had friends over for dinner, and we were all gathered in the living room, laughing and talking. The sounds came again, loud, unmistakable crashes from the kitchen. Everyone froze. We all looked at each other, wondering if we had heard the same thing. I was already up and rushing toward the kitchen before anyone else could speak. There was nothing there. No broken dishes, no mess, just an eerie silence hanging in the air, as if the kitchen was daring me to make sense of it. I remember feeling a mix of frustration and unease, like I was being made to look foolish in my own home. The sound had been so real, so tangible, and yet nothing was out of place. And that wasn't the only oddity. There was one room in the house that had its own peculiar energy. It was an ordinary room, nothing special about it. But one day, while I was in there alone, I saw something strange. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, I saw a small boy standing in the far corner of the room, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something from a different time, and he didn't move, he just stood there, perfectly still. I froze. I didn't believe in ghosts, so my first thought was that I was imagining it. I blinked, looked again, but the boy was still there. I felt my heart race, but my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps I had dozed off for a moment and had a dream. But over the next few months, I realized I wasn't the only one who had seen things in that room. Another person who stayed in the house mentioned seeing a boy in that very same spot. Then, another friend, someone I hadn't spoken to about the experience, described seeing a cat in the same room, a small, sleek black cat that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. I hadn't told anyone what I had seen, mostly because I didn't fully believe it myself. How could I? I had never been the type of person to believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything paranormal. But when other people started describing things they couldn't have possibly known about, things I hadn't told them, it started to feel less like coincidence and more like something I couldn't explain. But even though the house was undeniably strange, it wasn't scary. I never felt threatened, never felt as though I was in danger. It was more like living in a house that had a mind of its own, with odd quirks that made it feel like it was alive in some way. The small boy in the corner, the sound of broken glass, the cat that appeared and disappeared. None of it was malicious, but none of it made sense either. There was a sort of comfort in the chaos, though. The house became a strange part of my life, one I couldn't shake even if I wanted to. I got used to the odd noises, to the occasional shadow moving out of the corner of my eye. After a while, it felt like the house was just another member of the family. When we finally moved out, I couldn't help but feel a bit sad. The house had been part of me for so long, its strange happenings a constant companion. And even though I couldn't explain any of it, I couldn't deny that the house had changed me. It had made me believe in things I never thought possible. To this day, I don't know what was happening in that house. Maybe it was haunted. Maybe it was just the quirks of an old building. Maybe it was something else entirely. But I'll never forget the experiences I had there. And I know I'm not the only one who had them. Even after all these years, I sometimes wonder if the house is still there, waiting for the next person to discover its secrets. You've made it through the hour. The stories are over now, and the night is quiet again. Let the silence soothe you. Whatever followed you from the tales, leave it here. You're safe, you're calm, and you're already drifting deeper into rest. If you enjoyed these stories, consider subscribing to Dark Reddit for more nightly chills. Until next time, sleep well